one of the initiatives of students after the illegitimate appointment of Melih Bulu, and it consists of Western languages and literature students. And to introduce our guest today, Kenan Behzad Sharpe completed his PhD in literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Uh, Actually, he was a Fulbright scholar based at Boğaziçi for the academic year of 2016 and 17, and he taught in various universities, including ours. I was one of those lucky enough to take his summer class last year, and I recommend taking the class he will be teaching this summer too. Apart from teaching, he also works as a columnist of arts and literature at Duvar English. His general research interests are social movements and popular culture in Turkey and the United States, aesthetics and politics, poetry and popular music, etc. Currently, he is completing his first book on Anadolu rock music and the 1960s in Turkey, which we are all looking forward to read. And without taking any more time, I'm leaving it up to you. Thank you for joining us, all of you.
Okay, there we go. Thanks so much, Yalmer, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone involved in Literature Unbound for inviting me. I think these kinds of student initiatives are really deeply inspiring, and it really is an honor to be here. It's great when you're invited by your colleagues to come speak in more formal academic contexts, but to be invited by students, and when they're not, they don't have to listen to you because they're teaching your class, but they actually want to have you participate and join is really actually an honor for me. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk about some poems and some themes that are important to me and that I hope might be useful and also even enjoyable for you too. I have to say that this initiative and the similar ones happening in Boğaziçi over the last few months remind me of things I've experienced when I was in Santa Cruz, California. So I did my undergraduate and master's and PhD at the same school, University of California, Santa Cruz. And it's a school, I don't know if people have heard of it, that's really famous for its history of protest and resistance of various kinds. And in all my years there, I saw various different movements happen and had the chance to participate as well. One interesting thing about Santa Cruz is that it's the campus is in the middle of the forest, and it's up on the hill away from the city of Santa Cruz itself. And one aspect of the geographical setup of the school is that when there are strikes happening on campus or there are other protests, it's really easy for students to block the entrances to the campus. So it's sort of this strategic point. And what will happen during various strikes or protests when students are down at the base of campus is that they'll hold classes there. There'll be kind of free university things like we've seen at Boğaziçi with, art, poetry readings, food sharing, dance parties, and the best professors among us there would hold their classes at the base of campus so as not to cross the picket line that the students or the workers were hosting there. And one of my favorite things that happened in this very idyllic campus full of green meadows and deer running around is that people would, like I mentioned, hold poetry readings. So I thought about this talk today, that we're not sitting in the grass of South Campus together, as kind of somewhere between a talk and a poetry reading and a discussion. So I'm going to be bringing up a bunch of different poems and trying to tease out some themes from these poems and some issues I think are worth thinking about. But I would also love to hear from people as we go. So I don't need this to be a lecture where I'm talking and everyone's silent, but I'd really love to have a conversation together. So in introducing me, Yalmer mentioned some of the things I'm interested in. I mean, poetry and protest, aesthetics and politics are things I worked on in my PhD dissertation, and also my publications and my future book projects as well. So this question of what is the relationship exactly between art and politics? What ways can art intervene in political struggle? And then also how does political struggle affect art. So this is not only content in terms of art or poetry about social movements, but also about form. What is the best form, or what kind of aesthetic strategies are used when art or poetry in particular is trying to intervene in political struggle or join in some way. And there's a whole, as you can imagine, variety of opinions about what the best sort of aesthetic forms are, from more direct statement of political belief, trying to convince readers, to things that are more abstract. Does a poem have to be about politics to be a political poem? These are the kinds of questions that are really interesting for me. And I look at various time periods. Most of my research is about the 1960s and 1970s in the US and in Turkey. I've done a comparative work about those social movements and the way cinema and poetry and the arts writ more broadly have been involved and were influenced by social movements. But I've also written about the 1930s, which is another big moment of global struggle all over the world, and the kind of anti-fascist movement, the Popular Front, the Spanish Civil War, and then contemporary stuff. As a journalist, I talk a lot about the way art in Turkey is involved in politics in different ways or responding to it. So this is kind of where I'm coming from. I thought it was helpful to mention that. I want to start, so like I said, I want this to be part talk, part poetry reading, part conversation. And I want to start with a poem that's close to home for me. It's a poem written about a social struggle from recent years in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where Santa Cruz, where I studied and lived, was located. So maybe the best way to start is to read the first of our poems here. I hope it's not so small that you can't read, but I wanted to fit things, but I'll be reading it out loud anyways for you. So this is going to be a slow presentation together with lots of poems. So this is a poem by Juliana Spar called Turnt. Juliana Spar is a contemporary poet. She's someone who's part of the political and poetry community in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's someone I could call a comrade. We're not close friends, but we have crossed paths a lot, and also a really respected poet in the United States. So this poem, I'll say after I read it what exact movement it's about, but I thought we'd start just with the poem itself. And it's a fun poem that's, plays with different linguistic registers, from very slang and informal to other points drawing on the history of poetry. So let's take a look at this. Turnt by Juliana Spar. Sometimes it feels like it's over and it's not. Sometimes it feels like it has just begun and it's over. It's dark often at these times. Urban though, so a certain version of light too. It's hard to predict if it will start on time or how late. I'm often a little late and it has started. Last night I could tell from the copters overhead that I was late. As I walked up, the blocks around it were emptying out. Parents pulled their children home. The night herons settled into the trees. That's the outer ring. As I got closer, all that was left were the blinking lights of the motorcycles blocking the intersections, and the men and few women in uniforms that mill about the corner, helmets in their hand. They talked among themselves, ignored me mainly. One told me how to get around. I did not clarify that I was walking towards. You can hear it sometimes. It often has a soundtrack. Sometimes it has drums and brass, sometimes just joy. When I'm late, I'm trying to guess its path. Last night, several times I got close to it, only to be turned back by a line of cops. They let the media through, but turned me back. Then it turned the corner, and there it was. At that moment, I melted my body into it, and it embraced me. Rosy-fingered dawn and all that. Come here, it sang, listen. And then I was borne along by the waves all night, and the whirlpool, the fig tree, and I was the bat hanging on patiently. Arav came up and hugged me. Someone grabbed me from behind, and I thought it was Artem, but later realized it was Berat. So much mask. I grabbed Charlotte's hand and held it for a while things felt dicey. It felt dicey as they cornered us from two sides, and we went down the tight side street, up the hill, Charlotte's hand. It's like that, moving from isolation to the depths of friends. At first, we didn't mask up. We were poets. Then slowly, one by one, we did, as we got turned. As I got turned, I mean. Sometimes I still don't mask up. It feels often hubristic. I keep a bandana in my pocket. It isn't super effective, it falls down a lot. Last night, I tied it around my neck as we walked up the side street hill. I pulled it over my face as I walked past the line of cops. I noticed Emma there throwing eggs. I ducked. 2 balloons filled with paint flew by, visors suddenly yellow. She said to me, "How is your heart?" And at first I worried her question. Then I realized she meant my heart and how it was turned. "It is good," I said. "I'm opening it. I'm expanding it." And I meant it. "I love you," I texted Felix. "Love you," I texted Haruto. Texting Isabella and Jackson, "I love you guys. I love you." I texted love some 43 times in the past few years. I texted heart some 33 times, love you 18 times, miss you 38. Poem continues. She said, "Your feed is all riots, plants, picnics, and poets." It was an accusation. She was noticing that I had got turned. And I said, my son is in my feed too." I didn't bother to argue the riot with her. Still, oh, that moment, turned moment. I was at the poetry reading and Mia didn't go. She was supposed to read too, but she didn't. She said she wanted to see what happens. Then she texts, "I love you." And then I know that Trader Joe's has been looted. All the wine out in the street. Such sweet elixir, FOMO. Then the rest of the night, we quickly said goodbyes after the reading, refused the offer of going to drinks, careened from the reading to our home, one of us on Twitter the entire time, texting too. While we were driving, one of us at home runs out into the streets towards the gas. I drive up and 2 of us get out of the car, and I stay in the car and drive the few blocks home. My son is fallen asleep in the back. I am coughing in the car from the gas. He sleeps through it. I take him out and carry him up to bed. More texts. "I love you," I text. "Come by at me when you're done." Later that night, I go out again. Miguel stays home with Minjun. I go to a fight party, Marxist versus nihilist. No one knows which is which. Mohammed, my fighting teacher, fights. I miss it. "I love you," I text. She texts me back, "I'm high on being slugged. My eyes are swollen. I'm lost. I'm turned." Standing outside, a woman gets out of the club. The bouncer tosses her out and into us. She's fucked up, and this feels awful to her. Her arms, wildly swinging, indicate this awful feeling. It feels awful to us. Another woman tries to help her, and she slugs her. She misses, and the woman who she has tried to slug takes her, calms her down. I hear her saying, "I love you," over and over. Later, I will learn that she spent the entire night talking the woman down. It's like that. When turned, sometimes one needs to be held. Still later, I stand on the street outside my house and watch the T-Mobile get looted. A man tries to stop another man who has his hammer at the ready in front of the window. The man who is attempting to stop the hammer gets hit in the face with the butt of the hammer. I decide to go to bed. It is 3 a.m. I text Nathan and I say, "I love you, and I'll leave the key in the box for you." The march continues on. Nathan continues on, turns a left block away, and then when Nathan texts me back, I know the Whole Foods is looted, and they are all drinking champagne, dancing. All of them will get a cold later. Riot champagne becomes a term among us that winter. I wasn't there, but I was there too. My germs were there. I too had that cold. Is this poem too heroic? I'm sorry. I worry it is. Or I know it is. We are turned to mere vandals at the moment. I'll admit it. Every computer in that shop, every phone in that one, every car in that car lot. I don't want it to be heroic, but last night I turned the corner and Nora was there with her bike, and when I saw her, I said, "I love you," and we walked down the street as each window was cracked. They got turned. Eventually we disperse. I jog for a few minutes away and out of the kettle. We joke, circle back to watch a car burn. Oliver walks by. He's hurrying towards the dispersal. "I love you," we say to him as he heads off. The car burns. The fire truck arrives. As I stand there watching it, it is as everyone I've ever texted "I love you" to walks by. "I love you," we call out to each other. A group of women walk by the car and stop to take photographs. So much joy they all have. They're laughing with such triumph, selfies and all turned. This poem is true. I have texted I love you and its variations over and over. Sometimes I barely knew you, but the names are not true. This is not a coterie poem. Is it a milieu poem? Can it be a movement poem? I took all the names of this poem and never wrote them in. There is no electronic record of them. I found a list of the most popular baby names for various countries in 2015, the year in which I am writing this poem. I made a list, one male and one female from each list. Then I alphabetized it, and I put those names in the poem one by one. I got to O. But Olivia, Sanvi, Santiago, Seoyan, Sophia, Yui, and Zeynep, I love you too. Okay, that's our first poem. It's a long one, so thanks for bearing with me, but I think it's a really fantastic one, and I wanted to start with something contemporary too. So one thing I love about the poem, there's many things. I mean, Juliana Spar has this very distinctive style that's, as much as poetry, it's very prosaic. I mean, she's talking about texting, the language is very kind of self-doubting and not really kind of classically poetic at all. And there's a lot of sort of repetition and chorus and even all these sections that are prose, which is really distinct for her. But I love how the poem starts out with this talking about it. She says, I'm often late and it has started. Or she says, I did not clarify, I was walking towards. But what is the it here? What is she walking towards to is not really named until we realize that she's meeting this mass of people. She's trying to find the protest. But in not naming it, it becomes this kind of larger than life force that she sort of inserts herself into like a wave. I also think it's really interesting, like I mentioned, the way she uses different linguistic registers. So we have the mention of FOMO, this very kind of internet age abbreviation for fear of missing out, and then the kind of heart symbol and all these kinds of things. But also she talks about entering the movement, entering the protest as being like walking into the rosy-fingered dawn, which is of course a really famous description used in Homer and in classical Greek literature. The rosy-fingered dawn is this epithet that's used over and over. So we have this mix of languages from emoji to classical Greek literature. And then turnt, which gives the poem its title and appears over and over, but which is again not really defined or named. It's not quite a word either, turnt. I mean, there's in kind of out of American hip hop culture, there's the idea of being turned up, kind of being hyped, being energetic, dancing, getting drunk, that kind of turned up. Also, if you look in older literature, something like turned is used in Shakespeare to talk about to be transformed. It can also be described as being turned. So there's this element of metamorphosis. But I think one way to think about it is this sort of subjective register of what it is to be part of a social movement. At one point in the poem, a friend asks her, how is your heart? And she says at first she doesn't understand the question, but she's asking about her heart and how it was turned. And she describes this as an opening or an expanding of the heart. So it's a really kind of powerful kind of shortcut to talk about this kind of subjective register of what it's like to be a movement. And really what this poem is saying is that joining a movement can be a lot like being in love. The kind of subjective register, it really affects people on that level. And I think people who have had experiences of this, I mean, movements are, difficult, painful, full of sacrifices, as everyone knows, but the moments of coming together can really be akin to something like a romantic relationship. You and this movement you enter, and the kind of feeling of being in a mass of people. And even if you don't know them, it's like, I love you, you're with me. I think this poem captures that really well. So these are kind of the things I wanted to bring out from this poem. There's also, another element of her kind of awareness of herself as a poet and how that's a kind of uneasy relationship to being in a social movement. She says at one point, we didn't mask up. People are covering their faces to hide their identity. This is before Corona. Masks were for a different reason. But she said we were poets, so we didn't at first. And then at another point, her friend accuses her of having her feed, in other words, her Instagram feed, of being full of riots and plants and picnics, as if, you know, it's not a thing we should expect from a poet to be sharing pictures of a riot or a protest. So this kind of uneasiness of, you know, what is my role in this? And also the question of, is this a milieu poem describing her kind of, you know, tight-knit kind of maybe elitist community, or is it a movement poem? And what would it mean for this kind of poem to be a movement poem? You know, movement poetry is, you know, as the name suggests, poetry that comes directly out of some kind of social movement. So, for example, in Turkey in the 1960s, we have all these small magazines. You know, people like Atol Behramoğlu and other kind of left-wing poets who are, you know, very much part of the movement, and then also have publication organs coming out of it, very much a kind of symbiotic relationship with the social movement. So she's asking here whether this is still possible, or in the United States, the Black arts movement, kind of the artistic wing of the Black Power movement, again, with their own publication organs and poetry reading networks and all this kind of stuff. This question of whether this kind of thing, movement poetry, is still possible in our moment. So let me pause here, because I do ideally would love to hear what other people think. This is an evocative poem. We have more to look at, but if anyone wants to say anything about what they thought of the poem, or what it makes you think of with your own experiences, I'm really open-ended if anyone wants to say anything or add anything. I'll just pause for a few seconds to give people a chance if they want to. If not, no problem. Okay, that's fine. We'll keep going, but at other points, feel free to write in the comments or raise your hand, and I'm really happy to have this be a discussion as well. I promised you I would tell you what movement this last poem, Turnt, was about, and it's about the Occupy Oakland movement that happened in 2011. Oakland, as you probably know, is across the bay from San Francisco on the West Coast in California. And you'll recall the kind of global Occupy movement that started with Occupy Wall Street, and, you know, in some ways even came to Turkey in the form of Gezi, though Gezi had its own separate origins, but of the same spirit, we could say. So Oakland City, which is a predominantly Black city in California, and with a real history of left-wing struggle, etc. Occupy Oakland began when people occupied a park across from City Hall in downtown Oakland. And they renamed the park Oscar Grant, who was an African-American man who was murdered by the police. And people started setting up a tent encampment in the park, again, sort of similar to Gezi with the tents, kind of creating this communal life, and then sharing food, having yoga classes, you know, the whole kind of thing. And then, of course, the cops came and tried to evict them, and did evict them, and then it led to various clashes in the street, riot police, tear gas, all those kinds of things. So the last poem was about this movement, and in 2011, and the kind of high point of the movement is when protesters, I think 6,000 protesters, walked to the port of Oakland, which is the 5th biggest seaport in the United States, and they blocked the port for an entire day and brought, you know, the entire thing to a standstill. So it was this kind of movement which many poets in the area were involved in as well, and that's what this last poem is describing. So I've given you one example, and I want to just quickly talk a little more about, I think, what some of the interesting things are with thinking about poetry and politics together. So like we've talked about, what exactly is the relationship of art in general, or poetry in specific, to social movements? Can it contribute something? Or can it actually intervene in the course of history, or in how movements are understanding themselves and what they do? Or is it kind of more reactive, that they're inspired by movements and this shapes, you know, the content or the form of the poem? Also, the relationship, like I said, between aesthetics and politics. These are questions that have been thought about a lot in different periods. Exactly, you know, what form of aesthetics is most conducive to thinking about or contributing to politics. And one classic example is among all these German Marxists, or German-speaking Marxists in the 1940s, who debated about this. So people like Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno had famous debates about this question, George Lukács, and the debate in Europe in the 20th century was often about socialist realism versus modernism. So socialist realism being, a very explicit statement of politics and kind of these heroes that one can look after, poetry that is, or literature, art, novels mostly, that are trying to educate people and tell them, how they should think, teach them about class consciousness, etc. Versus modernism was a lot focused more on subjectivity. It was more experimental in form. Often you don't have explicit statements of politics, but the idea is that, art shouldn't be brought down to the level of politics. It should actually transform people's subjectivity, the way they think, the way they feel. So art's job is not to produce slogans, but actually to hit you on this kind of more, sort of more complex level in terms of your subjectivity. So these kinds of debates. There's also different types of political poems, poems like the one we just saw that describe the experience of a social movement. Other poems that are call to arms, actually telling people, come in the streets, be aware of your power. Others that are, have a more ambiguous relationship. Maybe not a single political word is said, or it's all sort of very ambiguous or vague, but is still somehow engaged with the idea of politics. So all these kinds of different things in the history. And in terms of the history too, this is not a new form. I mean, political poetry in terms of a kind of call to arms is something that's really been happening mostly since the 19th century. But there are, really old examples of political poetry. So for example, the classical Roman poet Horace had a lot of political poems, which mostly take the form of satire, teasing or making fun of various political figures or noble people, etc. So that political poetry in its early stage has a close relationship to humor. The same thing in the case of classical Arabic poetry. There's a whole genre called hijab, which is where we get our word hijiv, satire again, satirical poetry, making fun of different political figures or kings, or giving advice through kind of allegory, like talking about a captain who can't control his ship or his crew, but it's really an allegory for a bad political leader, etc. So in the earlier context, political poetry is mostly this. It also has a close relationship to folk poetry, kind of another line of this. So for example, in our context, we have Pir Sultan Abdal, very closely related to music and to folk poetry, the kind of pieces that can be memorized, recited, put to music, shared, etc. But political poetry as we know it today really comes out of the 19th century as you start to have working class movements appearing all over the world, but particularly in Europe. And England was a really important site for this stuff, for explicit political poetry trying to call people to action. So I want to briefly show you one of the most famous examples, which is from the English romantic poet Percy Shelley. So he wrote this poem. It's a long poem. I only put a little piece on here called The Mask of Anarchy. And it's a British political poem from 1819 responding to an event called the Peterloo Massacre, where people had gathered in Manchester, England, to demand reform. They wanted parliamentary representation rather than the king to control everything. And the king's cavalry, charged into this crowd of about 60,000 people, and many people were killed in the process. And Percy Shelley wrote a poem responding to this event. And actually, I want to look at lots of things today. So let me just show you the final stanza here, which is the most famous anyways from this poem, where Shelley says, "Rise like lions after slumber, an unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. You are many, they are few." So these lines are really famous. It's been used in songs. Mahatma Gandhi recited these lines at various political events and protests. More recently, in Tiananmen Square in China, in those protests in the late 80s, this poem was used. The old leader of the Labour Party in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, also used these lines. So it comes up again and again and shows how this stuff is remembered, remobilized, etc. But the interesting thing about the poem is that it's calling for nonviolent resistance against injustice. It addresses the soldiers who charged into this group of unarmed, peaceful protesters, and says that you will now be shamed. People will see you in the street and point to you. The noble soldiers among you will quit, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, it's addressed to the masses, saying that you are like lions who've been sleeping. And when you rise up, your chains will fall off you like dew. And you need to remember that you are a mass of people and the rulers are just few. So it's really directly a call for action, a kind of poem that's trying to intervene quite directly in political events of the period. So this is a model for it. And we have another one closer to home, and I was going to get somebody's help to read the poem from Yashar Nezihe. This is a really interesting poem about May Day, about May 1st, from 1923. The writer Yashar Nezihe is not really extremely well known, but she's a really interesting figure. And her poem, Bir Mayıs, is the first poem written about International Workers' Day in Turkish. And it's also really interesting that it's a woman writer who wrote this first poem, because we often think about left-wing movements, especially in early periods, as really dominated by men. So this poem was published in the left-wing magazine Aydınlık in 1923. And she's an interesting figure who lived from 1880 to 1971, so quite a long life, and was active in the workers' movement, a kind of working class poet who very much wrote poetry addressed to workers, to the masses. So I think one of our volunteers, Yavuz Selim, I think, or Berfe was going to read this. Can I get your help?
Yes, I can start right now. Bugün hür yaşamak hakkı seninken, patronlar o hakkı senin almışlar elinden. Sayınla edersin de tufeylileri zengin, kalbinde niçin yok ona karşı yine bir kin. Rahat yaşıyor, işçi onun emrine münkat, lakin seni fakretmede günden güne berbat. Zenginlere pay verme, yazıktır emeğinden, azmet de esaret bağı kopsun bileğinden. Sen boynunu kaldır ki onun boynu bükülsün, bir parçada evlatlarının çehresi gülsün. Ey işçi, Mayıs 1'de bu birleşme gününde, bir şüphe bugün kalmadı bir mani önünde. Baştan başa işte koca dünya hareketsiz, yıllarca bu birlikte devam eyleyiniz siz. Patron da fakir işçilerin kadrini bilsin, tazim ile hürmetle sana başlar eğilsin. Dün sen çalışırken bu cihan böyle değildi. Bak fabrikalar uykuya dalmış gibi şimdi. Herkes yaya kaldı, ne tren var ne tramvay. Sen bunları hep kendin için şan-ı şeref say. Bir gün bırakınca işi halk şaşkına döndü. Ses kalmadı, her velvele bir mum gibi söndü. Sayende saadetlere mazhar beşeriyet, sen olmasan etmezdi teali medeniyet. Boynundan esaret bağını parçala, kes at, kuvvetedir hak, hakkını haksızlara anlat.
Great, thank you so much. So it's a really fascinating poem written in these, of course, rhyme couplets. And what's interesting about it, it's quite an old poem, and there's a few words that are not used anymore in modern Turkish. But overall, you can tell she's made a serious effort to write in a manner that's understandable and memorable, because the point of this poem, of course, is to speak to the worker. Of course, it starts with a direct address, ey işçi, directly calling on workers. And the message, as you understand, is that, it's basically calling for class hatred, that the workers are, what's the word? Tufeli, asalak, I'm forgetting the English right now, parasites, and they're living on your labor. And you need to hold resentment and a grudge against them. And you need to remember that you actually have the power, that she talks on the right side here about strike. And when the workers are not working, all the factories are as if they've gone to sleep, and there's no trains, there's no tramway, and this should be a source of honor for you. So it shares a lot actually with Percy Shelley in terms of coming from the same sort of tradition of political poetry, a direct address to the masses, trying to teach the people a lesson, which is that they have the power, and explaining, that in striking or in collective action, you are actually the most powerful force there is. So really an amazing poem, and really a quite early date for a poem like this. I think it's really a helpful poem to remember. I bring it out every May Day and share it and tell people to read it. It's a great part of this history. I want to move on because we've already been doing this for 40 minutes and there's so many interesting things I want to show you. I might go quickly over some of these poems just for the sake of time. But a different style of poetry is this example from Bertolt Brecht. It doesn't have the same triumphant tone where it's trying to convince people of something. It's more melancholic. It's coming out more out of an experience of defeat. But it also has really something interesting to say about movements and people's relationship to it. So Bertolt Brecht, of course, was a famous German Marxist, mostly famous, of course, for his plays. And in his plays, he was very focused on educating and creating kind of plays that people would watch the way you'd watch a sports game, that you'd want to intervene and say, no, don't do that, do this, and have not put people to sleep through entertaining them, but really bringing them to life and teaching them how to think. His poetry can be a bit different sometimes. This poetry is from 1939, when Brecht has fled Germany, now firmly under the control of the Nazis, and he's hiding out in Denmark. And he has some survivor's guilt about being safe in exile while many of his friends are still in serious danger. So I'll just read little parts of this because it's long, but it's called To Those Who Follow in Our Wake. And I just love the way it starts out. It says, truly, I live in dark times. An artless word is foolish. A smooth forehead points to insensitivity. He who laughs has not yet received the terrible news. What times are these in which a conversation about trees is almost a crime? For in doing so, we maintain our silence about so much wrongdoing. And he who walks quickly across the street passes out of the reach of his friends who are in danger. So I love this issue of dark times, which I think is not just true for the 1930s in Europe, but many of the times we're living in are dark as well. And the question the poem starts with is what does one do in dark times? And in some ways, what is the role of art? He says, an artless word is foolish. So not artless in the sense of without art, but not any kind of word that's not crafty or aware of itself is just pure foolishness. Similarly, if you have a smooth forehead, one that's not wrinkled with anxiety and doubt, it means you're insensitive. Being able to laugh means you're not aware of just how bad things are. And things are so bad that even talking about trees is a crime because it means you're ignoring all these other things that are happening. So it's almost a poem about, what is the role of art in this period? I mean, if we think of kind of classical romantic aesthetics as talking about the beauty of nature, and art's role is to inspire and uplift, he's saying if you're writing an uplifting poem, you're an insensitive jerk, basically, because you're not aware of just how bad things are. So there's a real kind of doubt about, the classic purpose of poetry and the aesthetic. If it's lulling you to sleep and teaching you about beauty, it means you're insensitive and you're clueless. So it's a poem really doubtful about what the aesthetic can do. I'll skip over this next portion. He's talking about how does one best live when everything is going wrong? If you're eating, are you forgetting that someone else is hungry, et cetera, et cetera. But the last part is just really, really wonderful. And it plays with time and tense in a really interesting way. So the first section is talking about the dark times. The second section kind of about his guilt of still being alive and having food to eat. And the third part speaks to us. It speaks to people in a future he can't yet comprehend, but in a future in which he's imagining that people will still be thinking about him and his generation and what they did and what they did not do. So he says, you who shall resurface following the flood in which we have perished, contemplate when you speak of our weakness, also the dark time that you have escaped. For we went forth, changing our country more frequently than our shoes, through the class warfare, despairing that there was only injustice and no courage. And yet we knew, even the hatred of squalor distorts one's features. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow hoarse. We who wish to lay the foundation for gentleness could not ourselves be gentle. But you, when at last the time comes that man can aid his fellow man, should think upon us with leniency. So it's really a kind of fantastic thing Brecht does here. I mean, people talk about this tense as the future anterior, kind of imagining, putting yourself in the standpoint of a future you're not yet in, and imagining what it might feel like. So he's saying at this point, in the future we're in, he and his generation have perished in the flood. They're dead and gone, and the dark times they lived in have consumed them. But he says, when you think on us with leniency. Don't judge us harshly, because you need to remember exactly what kind of times we were living in, when everything was injustice, no one was outraged, and we're constantly traveling the world trying to find safety. And then he says something really interesting about what it's like to be in a movement fighting injustice, and what some of the dangers are, that even hatred of squalor, or squalor is another word for poverty, can distort one's features, like the creased forehead we had at the beginning. And then that wonderful line of, we who wish to lay the foundation for gentleness could not ourselves be gentle. This idea that to fight injustice, you can't necessarily live the utopian world you want in that moment, because you're forced to struggle and you're forced to deal with so much. Of course, this is a thing that's debated a lot in different movements. The kind of Leninist communist tradition that Brecht came out of thought that people needed to sacrifice in the present and be organized and willing to withstand torture and be part of a sort of vanguard, so that in the future people can live the happy days. We can't be gentle, so that one day you will be able to live gentleness. Of course, the anarchist tradition and the feminist tradition and many others have criticized this version of struggle as sacrifice in many ways, but it's still an interesting statement of these kind of contradictions. We wanted to lay the foundation for gentleness, and it meant that we couldn't be gentle ourselves. I'll pause for a second in case anyone wants to add anything or say something, but it's a really fascinating poem. And it begs the question of, if one is fighting for a world that's beautiful, can you experience beauty in the present, or what role does it have in our present? I think we think about this a lot differently. We think the movement should, in some ways, be prefigurative of the world you want. Prefigurative meaning in the very action of struggling, you're also manifesting the world you want, not sacrificing so it can happen in the future, as if you're being good now so you can go to heaven later. Okay.
Yeah, Selim.
I wanted to mention what you also said about the first poem. Being a poet during these times, during times of protest, or during times of when Brett mentions changing the country more frequently than the shoes, it has to. I feel like poetry and being a poet, you have to kind of be able to reflect and take yourself out of the situation, out of the movement. But at the same time, these movements, what they mention are, they want to be the moving force in the movement. So I think these two poems create a beautiful contrast in how we can approach this this contrast. I mean, this paradox.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I mean, it's really a different worldview between these two poems. They're both political poems. They're both intervening or responding, but they have really different idea about, again, it's what poetry, which is kind of a stand-in for the aesthetic or art in general, what kind of relationship it has to this stuff. And I think these poems that are doubtful about poetry are really, really fascinating, because what we see in political poetry is often this questioning of, does art even matter? Does it even, what role does it have? Some are really, and what you see these two tendencies, one is a kind of overestimation of the role of poetry, that poetry gets you in touch with what it means to be human, and reminds you of what it is to live. And we see this in people like Audre Lorde, the African-American poet, who talks about poetry in a really positive and strong way, and other people who have a lot more suspicion about it. These tensions are really interesting to track, and it's one reason I love this topic, because I think it's not, no one settled the question, for good, of exactly what the relationship of aesthetics and politics is, but it's I think one we have to think about, because it also brings us to the question of, what relationship do our movements have to joy? What relationship do they have to pleasure, to community, to all these kinds of things sort of come with this question. Okay, let's take a look at another one. I'm actually going to skip this one. I wanted to talk about this wonderful Pablo Neruda poem, I Explain a Few Things, that talks about the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And it starts with this beautiful scene of him living in Madrid. And then the bombing starts by the fascist ruler, Francisco Franco, etc. It's a really interesting poem, but for the sake of time, I want to skip it actually. But he has people saying, why don't you talk about beautiful things in your poem? Why don't you talk about the volcanoes and the earth? And his response is, come and see the blood through the streets. Come and see the blood through the streets. Come and see the blood through the streets, which is the kind of crescendo with it, which it ends. And really interestingly, it's again, pulling you out of beauty and poetry and saying, go into the streets and see it. But the enjambment, the breakup of these lines kind of show a certain power that poetry has at the same time. Because even through this emphasis of the same sentence said 3 times, you get a different meaning because of where the accent falls. So come and see the blood in the streets has a different meaning than come and see the blood through the streets, etc. So a cool poem, but I want to skip it for now and look at a poem that has a lot to say about exactly the relationship of poetry and politics. So this is not a very well-known poem, but one I think is really fascinating by Manolis Anagnostakis, who was a Greek poet, both an existentialist and a Marxist, who was part of the resistance movement in Greece in the 1940s. So we forget, I think, historically, depending how good your history is, that Greece during World War II was occupied and invaded by first Mussolini's forces and then by Hitler's forces. And there was a partisan movement to liberate the country. This poet was part of that movement and was thrown in jail for it because after the war, there was a civil war between the right wing and the left wing who had just kicked out the Nazis, and a lot of left-wing poets were persecuted. And in this poem, he's speaking with an imaginary person who's telling him, you shouldn't be writing political poems like this because you're betraying poetry. Poetry shouldn't be, it should be flowers and volcanoes and trees, like Brecht was against, not talking about politics. And this is his response. You're betraying poetry again, you'll tell me, man's most sacred expression. You're using it again as a means, as a pack mule for your sinister objectives, in full knowledge of the damage you're doing to the young through your example. And now his response. Tell me what you have not betrayed, you and your kind, for years and years, bartering your possessions one by one in international markets and common bazaars. So you're left without eyes to see, without ears to hear, with lips sealed, and you say nothing. For which of man's sacred rights are you arraigning us? I know, preaching and rhetoric again, you'll say. Well, yes, preaching and rhetoric. Words have to be hammered like nails if they're not to be lost in the wind. So really interesting poem, and as the title tells you, it is an expression of his poetics against as poets like him would say, the bourgeois notion of art that is separate from politics in the world and trying to uplift you to something sacred. The criticism against him is that political poetry that isn't trying to uplift you and talk about trees and beauty and universality is a means. You make it a pack mule, like a donkey carrying something for you. The poem is just like a car that you fill with a message. And he's saying, you guys are hypocrites. What haven't you sold over the years? And that wonderful end statement that why his poetry is like this. So clear, it sounds like, kind of very everyday conversational language with short statements, call and response, very colloquial, very not poetic in a sense in the language used. And he's saying that the reason he does this is because words need to be hammered like nails, so they're not lost. You need direct, to the point statement of your message if you're going to have a political poem. So this is a different line than we've seen so far compared to the other poems. It's a bit different, than both Brecht and Spar in some ways. And this is, a line we see, a sort of school of political poetry that has this idea that you need to be direct and clear and unambiguous. Another example that approaches this kind of clarity almost reaches the level of an instruction manual. And I think it's just really interesting and fantastic. of, we have poetry and we have the world or politics, and people are trying to make them, some poets try to make them meet as close as they can. And I think one of the closest points is poems that are actually giving you directions or instructions for people in the movement. So people who took my summer class last year on the American 60s will remember that I really love the poetry of Diane de Prima. I want to look at one of her revolutionary letters, which is kind of, I think, some of the furthest point we can go of poetry trying to enter the world. So Diane de Prima is not a really well-known poet, but she is one of the beat poets in the United States from the beat generation. You probably know Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, et cetera. The women in that movement, of course, as always happens, get remembered less. But I think she's by far one of the most fascinating figures, partly because she really joins together the hippie movement, which she became part of in the 60s, and the radical American left. These things were often in competition. People who were taking LSD and listening to the Grateful Dead were different than the people often, putting their bodies in the streets to fight the war in Vietnam. But there are figures like de Prima who bring these two things together. And she wrote a series of poems starting in the 60s and continuing until her death a few years ago, called in this series, The Revolutionary Letters. And they are meant to be letters. They are directed to the reader, and they tell the reader various pieces of advice. And the language gets just about as far from poetry in its classical definition as you can think. So let me read this letter for you. Every time you pick the spot for a be-in, a demonstration, a march, a rally, you are choosing the ground for a potential battle. You are still calling these shots. Pick your terrain with that in mind. Remember the old gang rules. Stick to your neighborhood. Don't let them lure you into Central Park every time. I would hate to stumble bloody out of that park to find help. Central Park West or Fifth Avenue, which would you choose? Go to Lovin's with incense, flowers, food, and a plastic bag. With a damp cloth in it for tear gas. Wear no jewelry. Wear clothes you can move in easily. Wear no glasses, contact lenses, earrings for pierced ears, or especially hazardous. Try to be clear in front what we will do if it comes to trouble. If you're going to try to split, stay out of the center. Don't stampede or panic others. Don't waver between active and passive resistance. Know your limitations. Bear contempt neither for yourself nor any of your brothers. No one way works. It will take all of us shoving at the thing from all sides to bring it down. So most of the revolutionary letters have this kind of very prosaic language. I love the poet Joshua Clover describes Diane de Prima's revolutionary letters as Georgics. So Georgic is a classical genre of poetry. Virgil, for example, the Roman poet, wrote Georgics, which is basically farming advice. It's advice for farmers, when to plant your crops, when to take a rest, what, the wheat plant, it works better if you plant it next to this one, et cetera, but in verse form. So a very old genre, the Georgics, giving advice for farmers. And in some ways, this is a contemporary or modern Georgic, telling people, giving instructions for how to be part of a social movement. So this is a poem, again, from the 1960s. And it's very concrete. So she's talking about New York, saying that, you got to choose where you're going to meet. If you meet in the park, then you're going to have a hard time if you get beat up by the cops finding a place to get help. But if you're on a busy street, you can escape more easily. Similarly, don't wear tight clothes, don't have earrings because that can get pulled off you or hurt you. You got to be prepared for tear gas, so make sure you have your bandana and your wet bandana, et cetera. And then ends with this kind of more general statement about a diversity of tactics, as they say, different people doing different things because we need everybody to make this thing happen. So it really is, a letter, this poem. It's a poem trying to reach into the world by addressing a group of people. And very interestingly, let me show you on the next page, these poems she wrote one at a time and sent off to this publication called the Liberation News Service, which is a zine, like a photographed magazine, published I think every week and sent all across North America. So these poems would be in the midst of news about the latest protest or different forms of interviews talking about what's happening in Vietnam, where to go, et cetera, it would be these poems in there. So it's very much a practical piece of literature, trying to teach and instruct and inspire, et cetera. I won't read this whole thing, this next one, but take a look at it later because it talks particularly about what one does on a campus, which I thought would be interesting to people. What happens when you're trying to hold a space and the importance of media and putting your message out in your own way, which I think is a lesson everyone is aware of now. Okay. I wanted to talk about a Mahmoud Darwish poem, but I think I might skip it for now. Maybe come back to it at the end if we have time. But it's a really powerful poem from Palestine, and we could talk about it later because it does something kind of similar. But I want to, in terms of the themes we're talking about, maybe bring this one to you as a kind of provocative poem, and then maybe we can have a more general conversation if people like. Because if I talk the whole time, we can't have a conversation. So this is a quite interesting one. Miguel James is a Venezuelan Trinidadian poet. So both, so a poet who writes in Spanish, and I think is still alive. He was born in 1953. And this poem is called Against the Police. I think it's just really an interesting one. My entire oeuvre is against the police. If I write a love poem, it's against the police. And if I sing the nakedness of bodies, I sing against the police. And if I make this earth a metaphor, I make a metaphor against the police. If I speak wildly in my poems, I speak against the police. And if I manage to create a poem, it's against the police. I haven't written a single word, a verse, a stanza that isn't against the police. All my prose is against the police. My entire oeuvre is against the police, including this poem. My entire oeuvre is against the police. So another take on this question we've been talking about. Let me just I see something in the chat. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to that. A really, really fascinating one, which puts a very different thesis forward in terms of political poetry. That even if he's talking about writing a love poem, even if he's talking about the nakedness of bodies or the earth, this is also against the police. So the interesting question is, what does this mean exactly? It's a different idea than Brecht's, that if you write a poem about a tree, you're just showing how insensitive you are, right? It's different than, Richard Nézihe or Shelley, in that it's not actually telling you to do something. It's saying that poetry itself, perhaps, maybe something about the aesthetic in general, is political, no matter what it's about. If it's maybe affirming life, or even just living as a form of resistance in his view. But every single word, and I can tell you, not every poem by Miguel James is directly political or about the police, but his really provocative claim is that this is still the case. Every word, even just writing a poem, is against the police. And I'm really curious what we think exactly this means. How might we see this as true is a very interesting question. So yeah, maybe we could just have a general conversation now. It doesn't have to be about these poems per se, or we could bring up examples, but I'm curious what you actually think from these different views we talked about. Is poetry just by means of existing, even if it's about love or nakedness or a tree, in some ways political, or in Miguel James' view, against the police? Or does it need to be more direct, actually give you instructions or ask people to rise up? Is it useful then? Or maybe we're thinking about it totally wrong altogether, and poetry and politics don't have a real relationship, that you might agree that we're betraying politics, betraying poetry when we put the message in. And I know people here have had experience with art. I mean, there has been many things started with a gallery on campus. There's been music, people have written songs, rap songs and others. There's been dancing. So the question, I hope, is one that's relevant to all of us. So I'd really just love to hear what people think at this stage. Anything you might want to share. We could use our last half an hour just talking.
Yeah, Selim.
I wanted to say that poetry in politics, or poetry in politics, political poetry, doesn't really. I think that it's hard to define that relationship, because it's poetry is hard to define, especially when you are writing it. If you are writing poetry, uh, I think like it's, why are you writing that way? Why are you trying to express yourself that way? But political expressions or poetic expressions, they are just natural ways of expressing yourself. I feel like it's like a sense, like hearing or seeing or speaking. It doesn't happen as deliberately as we think that it happens. So I guess something that is so instinctive, something that happens so intuitively, it's hard to both separate one from another, but also it is hard to merge them to each other. I feel like there are different ways of expressing, and I also try to write poetry. I write poetry in Turkish and English, and what I observe when I'm writing in two different languages is I write mostly personal poetry in Turkish, while I write more political in English. And I feel like that's about how, I think that's about hope in some way, because I'm less hopeful in Turkish while I'm expressing myself in Turkish, while I'm thinking in Turkish, while I'm living in Turkey. But speaking or expressing myself in English, it gets political much more easily, because what is personal to me is really political. So I don't know. I just wanted to express these. These came up to my mind as we were reading these poems.
Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, it brings up the question, like, what the first thing you mentioned, what is the source of poetry? You were saying it's mostly inspiration, like it's whatever comes to you, maybe not as planned as we think. And that may be true. I mean, maybe the question is, not so much deliberate as, if people want to write political poems, it's whatever comes to them in that form. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But it's also, I think, helpful to recognize how our views of literature can be shaped by history. I mean, the emphasis on inspiration, for example, is a very 19th century notion. Coming from the Romantics, right? That we're overwhelmed with emotion, and then poetry sort of just comes out automatically, right? It's not saying it's not true. I'm just saying it also has a kind of history to it, and we can definitely live it that way. But then other people would argue, yeah, that it's more, it's a craft and it's designed, and especially if you want to make a change in the world, it's done very purposefully. But it's that tension is always there. I think that's the tension we're seeing in the poems too, between those two views in some ways. And then the other thing about language you said is really interesting, that in Turkish it's more personal, and you said, I think, pessimistic, right? And then in English it might be more general and public, in the way language can affect us.
Yes, it's like English poetry. When I try to write in English, I feel like there's something revolutionary, or some, like it's like the revolutionary letters. Inspiration, my inspiration is mostly political matters, but personal matters tend to stick to Turkish, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. Does anyone else want to add anything about any of these topics?
I think at this point I should remind you all the class is being recorded and live streamed, but it will not be shared publicly with anyone. We're just keeping it as a memory, kind of. And I just would like to look back at it and take better notes. So just feel free to share your thoughts and whatever you like. Nothing will be used against you, I guess.
That's good to know. It's important in these moments. I'll just wait a second. Yeah, go ahead.
I also wanted to say that Revolutionary Letter 8 was a great poem, and it made me think about all the stuff that happened during the protests, like during the first couple of weeks, and the ones with the police, which was almost all of them. It's weird reading about those times and just having memories of your own that just come as flashbacks, because it's so relatable. It's almost the same experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting how universal some of these elements are, of what it's like to be in a crowd and to remain safe and all these kinds of things. I mean, the advice still is helpful all these years later. And she goes to really wacky places in that book too. I really recommend it. I mean, some of the poems are practical like this, and some of them are like, you know, it might be that you have to hide out a friend in your house from the police and then protect them and this kind of stuff. But other poems are really very much countercultural. And she's like, we're all going to sit in the park and we're going to drop LSD. And if we all use kind of our mind power, we can stop the war through like hurling weapons, psychic weapons at the police and our enemies. So it has this very practical and also very spiritual. And there's stuff about the best food to eat, saying that like, if you eat processed foods, the government's controlling your mind. So you need to eat macrobiotic food. You know, it's really of that moment historically. Yama, you wrote something about the poem. I wanted to make sure we don't forget that. The personal political thing. Yeah. Do you want to say something about that? That's so important.
My point was, what I had in mind was much more general. It was related to those who follow in our wake. I think being able to do any kind of art, be it a poem or a painting or what people are right now collecting with the art collective, regardless of the whatever they went through in the past months, just being that the case, regardless of the subject, is a great way of protest. Just because protest is not always just saying we don't want an appointed director and whatever. People know that by now. And I think people admire the Boğaziçi protests so much because of our different ways of protesting, which is this case with the art. So it actually puts this resistance closer to success or more popularity. Or so I'm very against that poem and disagree with it so much, and would say that we need art to success.
Cevza Hocam, I think you're leaving, but thank you. Oh, she already left. I was going to thank her.
She left.
Yeah, I think Brecht's view probably feels really dated to a lot of us. I think we want to have movements that don't just, you know, we're mean now so we can be gentle later, or sacrificing now so we can be happy later, but actually we want that in the moment, I think is often how we think about it. And that's partly, Yağmur is right, partly a result of the personal political ethos coming out of the feminist movement. I mean, that's sort of, I think, common sense for us now. And personally, I think it's a good common sense. I don't want to be a you know, ascetic militant who sacrifice everything and has no joy or pleasure in my life. I mean, we saw that in the 1960s Turkish movements as well, to some degrees. The, you know, bir devrimcinin sevgilisi olmaz, that whole mentality, for example.
I think maybe we can speak more freely right now if no one's raising their hands.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you think, or just about, you know, the way the art's been part of your movement. I know has been really important, and what people think of that. Or
well, it's been really important for the movements generally. I mean the part about the Bone Sergi, the Kabe picture or whatever it was called. It was a big discussion, and I mean, interpreting art became a big question for us because there's a great number of there's a big number of Muslim students who were offended by that artwork, and there were some LGBTI plus students who were offended by the Muslims being offended because some of them were offended because of the flags, the LGBTI plus flags on the artwork. So it was hard to establish a consensus because maybe there isn't, maybe it's not correct, but it was hard to establish a consensus that artworks can be interpreted in multiple ways and no one should be persecuted or no one should be taking meanings that will be I mean that will invite persecution from the state. But yeah, it suddenly became an important discussion for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was really interesting to watch happen. The way, like people like me often think like, oh, can art do anything in the world anymore? It seems like that era is done. And then from to the highest levels of the state, this piece of art was being discussed, and the question of interpretation became a really central one, like you're saying, which is fascinating and shows how often, I think an awareness of what interpretation is. I mean, for those of us who are students of literature, this is our bread and butter that we're always thinking about, but how little, people outside of that field will have an awareness of these issues and the question of being offended, interpreting a piece of art, whether or not the artist's intention matters, like what you get from the work versus what they intended, all these kinds of questions. And then also, I mean, if we think about that piece of art, in some ways it was obviously political, but in a way where if you didn't read the artist statement, you would be forced to interpret it, right? It doesn't give up its political message in a really direct and clear manner. It's not hammered like nails, like Manolis Agnostakis says, the Greek poet we looked at. So then when things are politically or aesthetically open-ended, also it invites room for different interpretations. Yeah, it's a really interesting case. And then there's also the question of, Yammer, you're going to say something?
I think art is also sometimes seen as something unproductive because it's not always so direct. And even if it's direct, sometimes people don't take it as seriously as formal documents, let's say. But what I heard from people when this question was also on my mind was because people were like detained or even in jail, it was it was bringing your mood down so much. But being able to produce art in this time and even pretend to have fun or like try to have fun is also a big way of resistance, because your enemy's, let's say, ultimate aim is to take your joy away from you. But if you still cling to that joy and do not let others to take it away from you, you ultimately win, even if they take everything, like your freedom, let's say, away from you, because your freedom is dependent on your joy. And you can, I don't know how to
this is great.
You can't have one without the other, but you still need both of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in that sense, it's making me think both of the Miguel James poem, in the sense that like he's saying even a poem about the nakedness of bodies, or he didn't say a tree, but that kind of example, or like any subject, a love poem, would also be against the police, meaning political in some way. And I think maybe you're saying something similar, that like even having fun together, even producing any kind of art or creativity when things are this bad, is a sign of survival and almost spite. It's like, in spite of you, I'm gonna feel pleasure and enjoyment together with my friends. It's like a middle finger to the forces that be, in a way, if you can still have joy and pleasure. Am I getting you right? Yeah. and seeing what is in your head as something worthy enough to put down. Yeah, because there's an element of self-respect in that too, that what you have to say and what you feel is worthy, definitely. And then it raises the question too of, the first poem we saw, of the feeling of being turned, this kind of feeling of togetherness, something almost akin to romantic love, of being with a giant group of people and feeling close to them. I'm curious what people think of that experience. If that sounds familiar to you, her way of describing that. Or if you think that poem captures something. Maybe too hard a question. Yeah, I go back and forth on these things, but I think the question of enjoyment and that feeling of kind of being turned, feeling something change in you. When we look at the history of poetry, political poetry, I think that's one of the most powerful things we see in it. And in that sense, again, I mean, a political poem is a love poem because, it's about that falling, that experience, and there's always a motivation behind political involvement that's not just anger, right? But also a deep love and a care for certain things, and you can see that in the poetry often. Well, I know we're only going to go for an hour and a half. I'm curious if other topics people want to talk about, or any of the other poems we have on the list we could look at, but I don't want to keep you too long either. And the people are on Zoom constantly these days, so if there's anything people would like to talk about or look at, we can do that. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. I'll wait a second in case anyone has anything. Okay, I guess we'll stop there then. It's been really fun to talk to you guys, even if I only see some of your faces. But yeah, again, these are topics really both part of my research and also dear to my heart personally. And I hope people found something helpful. Maybe you'll check out some of these poems or some of these writers later on, because I think at the very least, whether poetry changes things or not, I think it's a sort of, can be a recharge of energy, the arts in these kind of moments. And I think seeing other examples of it from other periods can often really, uplift and inspire. That's always been my experience, is kind of recharging the batteries through this kind of work. And I wanted to say too that if people, let me write my email address here in the chat. If people have any questions or they want recommendations or just want to talk about any of these issues further, or maybe you're, writing a thesis or doing a research project or any sort of topic, I'm always happy to help, and can be reached at kenanbsharpe@gmail.com. And I see some thank yous in the comments, and thank you for that. So it's been really fun. It really is an honor to be invited by you guys to talk about this stuff. And I was happy to share these thoughts and these poems with you. So thanks for the conversation.
And it's an honor to have you as a guest. We are very happy to continue our open classes and to continue with this one, because it is dear to our heart as well, both readers and writers of poetry. And thanks to everyone who had time to listen to us and anything. I don't really know how to close, but I think that is all that we want to share. Be sure to keep an eye on our Twitter and Instagram, because there will be other classes in the future. And yeah, that's all. Thank you all for joining us. I will close with a song, and you can leave however you want.
I'm curious what song it is.